Thanks to the organizers of this conference. I really appreciate the attention to footprint. We need to practice a less destructive way of living, and every flight not taken is an important step in that regard. Thanks also to those watching. I hope that you get in touch or contribute to the Q&A should anything in the talk strike you. Here's the outline. First, I'm going to do a short version of the long history of climate change. Second, I'm going to talk about the market ideologues and their central role in why so little has happened. Third, a little bit on where we're at today in 2016. Fourth, why I care so much about climate change. And then we go to the heart of the talk. We need a mass movement at the scale of the abolition movement to do something about climate change, to save ourselves. In order to build that, I use a Bourdieusian framework and argue for a more compassionate kind of activism. So let's begin with some history. I'm recording this talk on May Day, a day rooted in the working people standing up for themselves against violence, oppression, slavery of the state and capital. Powerful people continue to try and erase May Day. Eisenhower, for instance, proclaimed May 1st to be Law Day. But regular people compel us to remember history. This happened 10 years ago when immigrants filled the streets and showed what a day without immigrants looked like in the U.S. The great people's historian Howard Zinn reminds us about history's importance. He said, "If we don't know history, it's as if we were born yesterday. And if we were born yesterday, anybody up there in a position of power can tell us anything, and we have no way of checking up on it." So, let's look historically and check up on what some powerful people have told us. History shows us that we've understood climate change since before the Civil War. In 1859, John Tyndall, this man here on the bottom left, correctly measured the heat-absorbing capacity of the most important greenhouse gases. A year before the official start of World War II, Guy Callender showed that humans burning fossil fuels was warming up the planet. He demonstrated this, not theoretically or abstractly, but with actual measurements. By 1965, the message had reached the most powerful men in the world. Lyndon Johnson, he said, "This generation has altered the composition of the atmosphere on a global scale through a steady increase in carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels." And at this time, protecting our planet was not a partisan issue. George H.W. Bush promised to combat the greenhouse effect with the White House effect. These guys were not going out on a limb. In 1979, the National Research Council said we had incontrovertible evidence that humans were heating up the planet. So, what happened? Well, conservatives began to see that global warming required market intervention. And the most extreme conservatives, the free market fundamentalist variety, they don't like government doing much of anything, especially telling industry how to operate. Now, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, many people were looking for a new fight. This included some elite Cold War scientists, like Fred Seitz, the man you see in the top right here, a one-time president of the National Academy of Scientists. While there was money to be made, fossil fuels are very big money indeed, the most vehement climate denial was and remains ideologically based. So conservative activists and scientists teamed up with fossil fuel interests. They borrowed directly from the playbook used by Big Tobacco, called FUD. They cast fear, uncertainty, and doubt on climate change, on the science, and on the tools to address this problem. They said the temperature gauges were wrong and cherry-picked data. Even if you think the planet's warming, they told us, it wasn't anything that humans were doing. And even if it was us, reducing emissions would destroy the economy and unleash hell, so we better maintain the present course. But it wasn't us anyways. Today, it's not us, it's China. It's sad that global warming denialists used, and continue to use, the very same strategy that caused cancer for millions in the case of tobacco. And there's a bitter irony here. Market fundamentalists help delay climate action, leaving us in a situation where massive government intervention is increasingly the only option that limits catastrophe. Sticking with our historical theme, let's look back in time again. I want to share a few points about the depth of the climate crisis because they help us see why we need a really powerful movement. All of human civilization, from the dawn of agriculture to the computer that is your phone, has taken place over the last 10,000 years when the climate has been remarkably stable. We have now destabilized the only climate system we have ever known. Now, there's about a 30 or 40-year delay between releasing emissions and when we really start to feel them. This is largely for two reasons. First, the oceans have enormous thermal capacity and have absorbed most of the heat so far. Second, aerosols, which is basically soot, have masked nearly half of the warming. It's complicated, but these aerosols have a short-term effect, and we will see this warming. Another important point is that we have extensive greenhouse gas emitting equipment, power plants, planes, production facilities, and so on, as well as even larger investments in infrastructure designed for that equipment, like the U.S. interstate highway system, for example. This represents trillions of dollars of capital, and capitalists don't like to lose their investments, which means these will produce more greenhouse gases. In 2010, the infrastructure that directly releases CO2 represented about another half of degree Celsius of warming. And of course, we have built a great deal of greenhouse gas emitting infrastructure since then, since 2010. Finally, the great danger that we are racing toward is positive feedback loops. They have started. For example, melting ice means darker water, which absorbs more energy, which melts more ice. Follow the latest science on the West Antarctic ice sheet if you really want to frighten yourself with what these positive feedback loops can look like. We've known for decades that temperature rise above 1 degree Celsius, which is about right where we're at, may elicit rapid, unpredictable, and non-linear responses. But thankfully, from what we can tell, the positive feedback loops have not yet taken control. Not yet. So here we are. We stand something like Wile E. Coyote. We only need to realize where we are to see how much trouble we're in. But hope is not lost. Only after we give up is hope truly lost. I want to talk a little bit about what climate change really means. Why do I care? Why does anyone care? Here's land area as it actually exists. Here's what happens when we resize based on historical emissions. These emissions really matter because CO2, the most important greenhouse gas, continues to heat the planet pretty much forever as far as our timeline is concerned. Europe and the US dominate here, as you can see. And what happens when we turn to impacts? Here's the map resized based on vulnerability. Country sizes show the number of people injured, left homeless, displaced, or requiring emergency assistance due to floods, droughts, extreme temperatures in a typical year. Climate change exacerbates these threats. China and India have around 200 million people living close to sea level. Contrast this with the image on responsibility. Think here of basic kindergarten or preschool ethics. Who made the mess should probably clean it up. And yet the richest and most powerful countries continue to cast blame and refuse to take responsibility. Okay, on to the heart of this talk. We need a mass movement to stop climate chaos. How do we do that? I started grad school in 2011 on the heels of the Arab Spring and protests all around the world. This was right when Occupy Wall Street got going. I spent time at Dewey Square with Occupy Boston. I loved it. Here were people really trying to change things. I have to admit something, though. I felt uneasy, like I wasn't enough of an activist. Partly this was because I wasn't sleeping there. Partly it was because of my privilege, the advantages given to me, a white guy who grew up in the suburbs with two college-educated parents. At the same time, I was a grad student with a good amount of debt. The financial crisis hit me hard because with my partner, we had bought a house in Chicago and had to sell it for 40% less than what we paid. All because the people at the wheel, bankers, government officials, investors, rating agencies, they were drunk with greed and power and short-sightedness, so they steered us straight into the financial crash. But I just didn't feel comfortable at Occupy Boston, and I wasn't totally sure why. As I spent the next few years with the climate movement, I saw a pattern where other activists struggled to fit in, feeling like they didn't know enough, or weren't radical enough, or just weren't cut out to be an activist. My training in sociology helped me understand this pattern. I learned a lot from a French sociologist named Pierre Bourdieu. He looked at the world in terms of different social fields where actors compete for position and for access to resources. People's actions correspond strongly to their class position. Here, Bourdieu, this man on the screen, talked about habitus, which is a kind of semi-conscious sense of one's preferences that are expressed almost automatically. This comes from one's upbringing, one's parents, and education. And again, this highly reflects one's class position. Social class is not just economic capital, money, assets, but also social and cultural capitals. Social capital consists of the resources linked to one's social network, especially the durable and institutionalized relationships that will be recognized by others. Cultural capital is one's cultural knowledge and experience, a degree or the kinds of books you've read, for instance. These capitals are exchangeable in some ways, so that possession of one will influence the others. Now, none of this takes place in a vacuum. All action is situated in social fields. Some are more clearly defined than others. The academic field that we are operating in right now is pretty clearly defined. We can be reflective here. This conference may represent a change in the way we do academic conferences. Academic Conferences 2.0 and organizer Ken Hiltner's opening talk. But will it count? Will our colleagues see it as a real conference? Will we treat it as a real conference? What makes a conference real? I was attracted to this conference because of the decreased emissions, even while I could still benefit from getting my ideas out to an audience. I was attracted because I have internalized something from the climate activist field. This idea that flying is perhaps the best example of a privileged kind of violence. A violence from above as opposed to the violence from below, stabbings, shootings that regularly fill corporate media. I imagine many people here are not here because this will be the most important scholarly conference in your field, but for reasons closer to mine. This might mean presentations will be dominated by junior scholars, which will make it more difficult to change the norms around academic conferences because we possess much less capital than our peers. But the young always win, eventually. So field analysis using Bourdieu's tools are useful and help us understand what is going on in the ways that people act. Within activist social fields, a kind of cultural capital I call activist capital signifies status. It marks off who should be respected and who doesn't know what they're talking about. Activist capital is that which activists determine is valuable. One way to gain activist capital is experience at actions. This image you're looking at is from the Flood Wall Street action, the day after the People's Climate March. While 400,000 people took part in the People's Climate March, only about 3,000 took part in Flood Wall Street. Only about 100 of those were arrested, and only about 10 of them took their cases to court. As things become more selective, they can provide more capital. Now, if someone has more money or for whatever reason can devote more time to activism, then you might be able to go to more actions or trainings or spend time reading about activism. These are all things that will give you more activist capital. Those raised by parents with activist experiences will have an advantage, just like those who went to school with more of an activist culture will have an advantage as well. Activist capital can be incredibly useful. When activist practices are similar, when they talk like each other, eat similar foods, wear similar clothes, when activists start to think in similar ways, well, all of this can be really powerful. This can keep people involved, sustain them, and drive them to do more activism. But remember that uneasy feeling I had at Occupy Boston? Part of that had to do with my limited experience with activist culture, with the behaviors of activists and the rules of this social field. Expressions of activist capital can be exclusionary. They can make things seem odd, complicated, uninviting, especially to new people and especially to people unlike activists. And herein lies the great paradox at the heart of activist capital. On the one hand, we want more activists with more activist capital doing great activist work. On the other, we need to be inviting and inclusive, especially to new activists and those who might not fit activist culture. So what are we to do? I believe compassionate activism is not only the best way forward, I think it's the only way forward. Activists, organizers for social change, they're the great hope of humanity. We can take on the tiny group that is benefiting massively from the status quo while hundreds of millions of lives are being cast into peril. We've done this before, from the abolition of slavery to decent working conditions to anti-colonial struggles. We've done it before, we can do it again, we need to do it again. But we often limit ourselves when we try to gain position in the activist field. When we use activist capital, our experiences and know-how in a way that marginalizes some voices, especially the inexperienced. This can create a stultifying culture. It develops around activist groups as they position and compete in a game that those outside of the activist field find confusing, cute, or sometimes downright repulsive. What I've found helpful, and what I've seen in the activists who really understand how to build a mass movement and how to cultivate lifelong organizers, even if they veer from the activist field, is compassion. Compassion to themselves and to others. That self-compassion is important because many of the competitive and exclusionary practices within the activist field are done subconsciously and with no intention to harm. They often come from a place of insecurity or a fear to show vulnerability. Walt Kelly's character Pogo had this great line, "We have met the enemy, and he is us." This is true in a sense. We can be our own enemies, like when we make it difficult for folks unlike activists to participate in activism. But we are also our best friends, comrades, and lovers. Indeed, we are our only hope. So we must try to be more compassionate. Compassionate activism is all about controlling activist capital and using it to build a more inclusive, loving, and ultimately more powerful movement. Compassionate activism allows us to use activist capital to sustain what is difficult work with high stress and little compensation, but we need to reduce the exclusion that it often causes. I think we need compassion, especially in climate activism, because of what we're up against. If a few people or even a few million could have changed this, we would already be there. But we aren't even close, and in fact, we're continuing to dig deeper into the crisis about as fast as we can. We can do this. We can save ourselves from ourselves. I think that somewhere inside of every one of us, there already exists the ability to do what needs to be done. I invite you to be compassionate in all you do. I venture to say you'll be more appreciated, more effective, and happier as well. And consider joining the climate movement. We could really use your help, and I promise some of us are trying to be really nice.